The year was 1941, a world consumed by chaos. Nations fell like dominoes under the iron fist of tyranny, but across the Atlantic a sleeping giant stirred. When the United States entered World War II, it wasn't just a new army joining the fight. It was the rise of a force that would change the fate of humanity. It was a peaceful Sunday morning on December 7, 1941. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon as sailors on the decks of battleships at Pearl Harbor prepared for another quiet day. Some wrote letters home, some played cards, and others simply gazed across the sparkling bay, unaware that within minutes their world would descend into fire. The waters of Hawaii reflected calm skies, but on the radar, unseen by most, came a storm, a fleet of Japanese aircraft carving their way through the clouds like shadows of death. Without warning, the first bombs fell. A deafening roar shattered the stillness. Flames erupted across the harbor as steel twisted and men screamed. Battleship Row was engulfed in chaos. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia were struck with devastating precision. Massive explosions ripped through the air, sending towers of black smoke into the heavens. The once clear Pacific sky turned into a canvas of destruction. It wasn't a battle, it was an ambush. America had been caught unprepared. The attack lasted barely 2 hours, but in that short window, Pearl Harbor was transformed from a naval sanctuary into a graveyard of metal and fire. Over 2,400 American lives were lost, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, the Pacific Fleet crippled, and the pride of the nation shattered. The sound of sirens echoed across Honolulu as civilians and soldiers alike watched in horror. No one could fully comprehend what had just happened, that an empire across the ocean had struck with such ferocity, dragging the United States into the deadliest war in human history. In Washington, D.C., the news spread like wildfire. Radios crackled with reports, families huddled in living rooms, and fear began to seep into the heart of every American household. But amidst the grief and shock, something deeper was born. A collective resolve, a unity forged in anger and disbelief. The sleeping giant had been struck, and it would not remain silent. Across the nation, factories that once produced cars and household goods began converting overnight into engines of war. The American industrial machine awoke with a thunderous roar. Men enlisted by the millions, and women stepped into roles they'd never known before, building planes, ships, and ammunition with unwavering determination. The attack that sought to break the American spirit had instead ignited it. Every blow Japan had struck only hardened the resolve of a people who now understood what was at stake: freedom, survival, and justice. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress the next day, his voice steady and heavy with purpose. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His words became a battle cry that echoed through history. The declaration of war followed swiftly, marking the beginning of America's full-scale entry into World War II. No longer a distant observer, the United States now stood as a central force in the global struggle against tyranny. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological awakening. For decades, America had watched conflicts rise and fall across the Atlantic and Pacific, reluctant to intervene. But now neutrality was no longer an option. The illusion of safety had been destroyed in a single morning of blood and smoke. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, but beneath those ruins was the birth of a new power, one fueled by vengeance and duty. In the days following the attack, stories of heroism emerged from the wreckage. Sailors diving into burning oil to save their brothers, medics working through choking smoke to tend to the wounded, pilots scrambling to the skies despite overwhelming odds. The spirit of resistance, that unyielding American grit, began to shine through the darkness. Each act of courage became a spark, each sacrifice a reminder that the war ahead would demand everything. The Japanese had believed that striking Pearl Harbor would cripple American morale and keep the United States at bay long enough for their empire to expand. But they had miscalculated the heart of their enemy. Instead of submission, they had awakened a force far greater than they could have imagined. Factories thundered day and night. Fields and towns emptied as young men marched toward recruitment stations. In every corner of the nation, a single message echoed: this would not go unpunished. The pain of Pearl Harbor became a unifying wound, a scar that would drive America's military, political and industrial might toward one goal: victory. The faces of those lost in the attack became symbols of purpose. Their sacrifice would become the fuel for every battle that followed, from the Pacific Islands to the beaches of Europe. The blood spilled in Hawaii would stain the conscience of a nation that now knew it could never again stand idle in the face of evil. The shockwave of that morning spread beyond America's shores. Allies rejoiced at the entry of a new powerhouse into the fight. Enemies braced for the storm that was coming. The balance of the war had shifted, not immediately in weapons or strategy, but in spirit. Because once the United States committed itself, it did so with a totality that reshaped the very fabric of the conflict. As smoke continued to rise from the smoldering wrecks at Pearl Harbor, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The Pacific would soon become a battleground of vengeance and endurance, but this was the spark that lit it all. America had been attacked without warning, humiliated in its own waters, and forced to face the flames of war. And from those flames, something powerful began to rise. A nation united not by conquest but by necessity. A force that would march across continents and oceans, determined to ensure that such a morning of terror would never come again. The endless blue of the Pacific Ocean stretches beneath the rising sun. The hum of carrier engines fills the air as the camera pans across the decks of American ships. Sailors moving swiftly, aircraft poised for takeoff, tension hanging heavy like the calm before a storm. Just 6 months after the devastation of Pearl Harbor, the Pacific was still bleeding. The United States Navy had been battered, its pride wounded and its power questioned. Japan's empire had spread like wildfire across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, seizing territory after territory, their fleets dominating every horizon. The Imperial Japanese Navy had become a specter of fear, and its next target was clear: Midway, a small coral atoll in the middle of the ocean. A speck of land that held the power to open the gates to Hawaii and the American West Coast. In June 1942, the fate of the Pacific hung by a thread. Japan planned to lure the remnants of the U.S. fleet into a trap, a final blow that would crush American resistance and force the United States into surrender. They came armed with 4 of their most powerful aircraft carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, carrying the same pilots who had delivered the deadly strike just months before. But what Japan did not know was that America had learned to listen in silence, to read the whispers of war before the enemy even moved. Through relentless effort, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked parts of Japan's naval code. They intercepted messages revealing the planned attack on a target referred to as AF. To confirm it was Midway, a clever deception was staged. A false radio message was sent from the atoll reporting a water shortage. When Japanese intercepts mentioned that AF is short on water, the truth was revealed. The trap was now reversed. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm and precise, prepared his forces not for survival, but for a decisive strike. The stage was set. On June 4th, the Japanese fleet approached Midway, confident and unaware that American carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, lay hidden in the vast Pacific, waiting like silent predators. As Japanese planes roared over Midway, unleashing a torrent of bombs and fire, the U.S. launched its first counterattack. It was chaotic, desperate, and costly. American torpedo squadrons flew straight into enemy gunfire, knowing the odds were against them. They were slaughtered almost entirely. Young pilots burned and crashed into the waves, their courage unmatched even in failure. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese carriers, in the midst of rearming and refueling planes for a second strike, were caught vulnerable. As they focused on the low-flying torpedo planes, the skies above opened with vengeance. From high altitude, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown descended through the clouds like hawks. In minutes, the Pacific erupted in flames. 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were struck almost simultaneously. The bombs tore through decks loaded with fuel and munitions, igniting infernos that no man could control. The heart of the Japanese fleet was consumed by fire. Sailors dove into the burning sea as explosions rippled across the waves. Hours later, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed a counterattack that damaged the Yorktown, but her fate too was sealed by evening, struck, burning, and finally sinking into the depths. By nightfall, the once invincible Japanese fleet had been shattered. 4 carriers, the same vessels that had rained destruction on Pearl Harbor, now lay beneath the ocean. Japan had lost not just ships, but the core of its naval air power and hundreds of its most skilled pilots. It was a blow from which their navy would never truly recover. For the American forces, Midway was more than a military victory. It was redemption written in fire and sacrifice. It proved that intelligence, courage, and precision could outmatch even the fiercest of enemies. It transformed the mood of the war, from survival to momentum. The sailors who fought at Midway carried the weight of Pearl Harbor on their shoulders, and in those few days they lifted it. The battle was a test of resolve and endurance. The men aboard the carriers faced the relentless sun, exhaustion, and the knowledge that a single mistake could send them to a watery grave. Pilots returned with bullet-riddled planes, some landing with barely any fuel, others never returning at all. The ocean became both a battleground and a tomb, a place where courage met chaos in the most unforgiving way. In Washington and across the nation, the news of victory ignited a wave of hope that had been absent since the war began. Newspapers called it the most stunning and decisive blow in naval history. For the first time, America had not only defended, it had dominated. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken, and the tide of war had begun to shift. Midway changed everything. It forced Japan onto the defensive, and gave the United States the strategic upper hand in the Pacific. The balance of power had been reversed, and though many brutal battles still lay ahead, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the outcome of the war had been rewritten in those 4 days of thunder and smoke. But beneath the surface of triumph lay the cost. Hundreds of American sailors and pilots lost in the vastness of the sea, their bodies never recovered, their names carved into the silence of the Pacific. For every explosion that marked victory, there was a sacrifice unseen, a life given so that the tide could turn. As the flames of the sinking carriers flickered against the night sky, the ocean swallowed both pride and pain. The air was thick with smoke and salt, the water littered with debris, and somewhere within that chaos, history itself shifted course. The Battle of Midway had not just saved the Pacific. It had proven that the American spirit, when cornered, was capable of unimaginable resilience. The ocean that had once been a symbol of Japan's dominance now carried the echo of their defeat. The United States had turned the tide, not through numbers or luck alone, but through courage, intelligence, and the will to rise from ashes. The shadow of Pearl Harbor began to fade as the horizon of victory started to take shape beyond the waves. For months, the Allies had prepared for this moment. The invasion of Nazi-occupied France, a colossal gamble that could decide the fate of the entire war. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall, a fortress of steel and concrete stretching from Norway to Spain. Mines, barbed wire, gun bunkers, and machine gun nests waited for whoever dared to challenge it. The Allied forces, American, British, Canadian, and others, knew that breaking through it would be a storm of fire and death, but it had to be done. The liberation of Europe depended on it. The American forces had trained for months under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Every plan, every code, every detail had been weighed with precision. The timing depended on tides, moonlight, and weather. Even the slightest change could mean disaster. Eisenhower himself carried the weight of the decision on his shoulders, knowing that if D-Day failed, the war could drag on for years, and countless more would die. In the early hours before dawn, waves of paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission was chaos: disrupt German reinforcements, cut communication lines, and hold key bridges until the main invasion arrived. Many were scattered by heavy winds, landing far from their targets, trapped in swamps or tangled in trees. Yet even isolated and outnumbered, they fought fiercely, lighting the way for the invasion to come. Then came the sound that would define a generation: the growl of thousands of engines as the Allied armada approached the French coast. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft carried nearly 160,000 troops toward Normandy. The sea was alive with motion. Destroyers, battleships, transports, all converging on one point. Above them, thousands of planes roared overhead, bombing German positions and clearing paths for the assault. The entire sky trembled with the power of war. The Americans were assigned 2 beaches, Utah and Omaha. Utah would see some confusion, but relative success. Omaha would become a nightmare. As the first landing craft neared the shore, the Germans opened fire. Machine guns, artillery, and mortars unleashed a storm of death. Bullets tore through the waves. Men leapt into the water, many sinking under the weight of their gear before even reaching land. Those who made it to the sand found no cover, only open beach, barbed wire, and the relentless scream of enemy fire. Bodies fell by the dozens, the sea turning crimson as waves carried the fallen back into the tide. Communication broke down, chaos reigned, and for hours it seemed the invasion might fail right there on the sand. But in the midst of despair, courage began to rise. Small groups of soldiers, drenched and bleeding, crawled forward inch by inch. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Medics dragged the wounded from the surf, and officers rallied whoever they could find to push inland. Omaha Beach became a test of the human spirit. Every yard gained was paid for in blood. Yet by afternoon, against all odds, the Americans began to break through the German defenses. The bunkers fell one by one, their gunners silenced, their walls breached. The beach that had seemed like a grave became a foothold for freedom. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division had landed nearly 2,000 yards off target. But that mistake saved lives. They met lighter resistance and quickly pushed inland, linking up with airborne troops who had held their positions through the night. Across the entire Normandy coast, chaos was turning into victory. The Allies had done what Hitler believed impossible. They had breached Fortress Europe. The cost was staggering. By nightfall, thousands lay dead or wounded. Yet the beaches were held. Behind them, a flood of reinforcements and supplies poured in. Within days, a solid front stretched across Normandy. The Germans were stunned, scrambling to respond as Allied tanks and troops surged forward through hedgerows and fields. The liberation of France had begun, and the road to Berlin was now open. For the American soldiers who fought that day, D-Day was more than an operation. It was a reckoning. Every step across the sand was a defiance of tyranny. Every explosion, every scream, every heartbeat was part of something far larger than themselves. The young men who stormed the beaches carried the weight of an entire world's hope on their backs. They were sons, brothers, fathers, ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, facing death so others could live free. The scenes that unfolded were brutal beyond imagination. Landing craft filled with lifeless bodies, medics kneeling beside the wounded, chaplains praying amidst chaos. Yet within that hell, there was something pure, an unyielding resolve that could not be crushed. The world would later call it the longest day. and rightly so, for every hour stretched into eternity. When dusk finally settled over Normandy, the beaches were secured, but the land was still alive with the echoes of battle. Fires burned along the cliffs, and the air was thick with smoke and salt. Soldiers dug in for the night, exhausted, shaken, yet victorious. They had endured the unendurable, defied the impossible, and turned the tide of history with sheer will. The invasion of Normandy marked not just a turning point in the war, but a turning point in the human story. It was proof that courage, unity, and sacrifice could overcome even the darkest forces of oppression. The success of D-Day breathed new life into the Allied campaign and sent a message across the world. The march toward liberation had begun, and the walls of tyranny were starting to crumble. The war in Europe seemed to be nearing its end. Allied forces had broken through Normandy, liberated France, and were pushing deep into German territory. Many believed victory was within reach. But Adolf Hitler, desperate and defiant, planned one last counterstrike. A gamble meant to split the Allied armies in two, recapture the port of Antwerp, and crush the will of the Western Front. The attack would come through the Ardennes, a dense forest the Allies believed impassable for a major assault. They were wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered. German artillery thundered across the front lines, lighting up the snow-covered trees. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by tanks and heavy armor, surged forward under the cover of fog. The surprise was total. American divisions stationed there, many young, inexperienced, and under-equipped, were caught completely off guard. The enemy had struck where they least expected it, creating a massive bulge in the Allied line that would later give the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans advanced swiftly, overrunning towns, capturing supplies, and forcing American units to retreat. Roads became choked with vehicles, snow, and chaos. Communication broke down. In the confusion, some units fought to the last bullet while others were surrounded and cut off entirely. The Ardennes became a labyrinth of fire and frost. The sky was gray, the ground frozen solid, and hope began to thin like breath in the cold. Among the most critical points of the battle was the small Belgian town of Bastogne. There, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division found themselves encircled by the advancing German army. Supplies were low, temperatures dropped below freezing, and snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft. The men were isolated, surrounded, and vastly outnumbered. Frostbite gnawed at their limbs, ammunition ran short, and food became scarce. Yet they held their ground. The German commander, confident of victory, sent an ultimatum to the Americans at Bastogne: surrender or face total annihilation. The reply came from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a single word that captured the spirit of defiance: nuts. That simple response echoed across the front lines, a symbol of unbreakable resolve. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the American forces refused to yield. They dug their trenches deeper, reinforced their lines, and waited for relief. The days that followed were brutal. Snow and smoke filled the air as shells rained down on the frozen town. The men fought not just against the enemy, but against the cold itself. Blankets were scarce, fires dangerous, frostbite rampant. Yet the camaraderie between soldiers grew stronger with each passing hour. They shared rations, offered warmth, and reminded each other that survival meant more than holding ground. It meant keeping faith. Elsewhere along the front, the German advance began to falter. The weather, which had initially favored them by grounding Allied air power, began to clear. The skies opened, and with them came a roar. Wave after wave of American and British aircraft, bombing German columns and cutting supply lines. The tide began to shift. Allied reinforcements moved in from the north and south, closing the ring around the attackers. On December 26th, elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and reached Bastogne. bringing desperately needed supplies and relief to the surrounded troops. The soldiers who had held the town were exhausted, frostbitten, and battered, but they had not broken. Their defense had bought precious time, halting the German momentum and allowing the Allies to regroup. The bulge in the line began to shrink as German forces were pushed back, losing both men and machines in staggering numbers. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Over 80,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire towns were reduced to rubble, forests torn apart by artillery. Yet within that frozen hell, stories of heroism and brotherhood emerged that would define the spirit of the American Army. Soldiers shared foxholes and faith under relentless bombardment, facing nights so cold that rifles froze in their hands. Still, they stood their ground. For the Germans, it was the last desperate gasp of a dying regime. Their fuel reserves were nearly gone, their tanks left stranded in the snow. What had begun as a bold offensive ended as a catastrophic defeat. The dream of splitting the Allied forces vanished with the winter winds. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and the road to Germany now lay open. But for the American soldiers who endured it, the battle was more than a military engagement. It was a testament to endurance. The bitter cold, the endless artillery, the hunger and isolation, all of it tested the very limits of human strength. The men of Bastogne, of the Ardennes, of the Bulge, they became living symbols of determination, their courage etched into the ice and blood of that frozen landscape. The snow that once concealed the enemy's advance now blanketed the dead. Fields once filled with battle cries now lay silent, except for the moan of the wind through shattered trees. The victory had not come easily. It had been bought with immense suffering and sacrifice. But through that suffering, the spirit of the American Army proved unbreakable. The cold had tried to kill them, the enemy had tried to crush them, yet they endured. As the winter slowly receded, the remnants of the German army retreated eastward, broken and beaten. The Allies had held their line, not just through strength of arms, but through the unyielding will of men who refused to fall. The Battle of the Bulge had shown the world what resilience truly meant, what unity under fire could achieve, and how even in the darkest, coldest moments, courage could still burn bright against the frozen night. By mid-1945, Nazi Germany had fallen. The guns in Europe were silent, but in the Pacific, the war raged on with no sign of surrender. Japan, though battered by relentless bombings, refused to yield. The Japanese military had sworn to fight to the last man, woman, and child if necessary. The islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had already revealed the brutal cost of such resistance. Tens of thousands dead. Entire landscapes turned to ash. American commanders knew that an invasion of Japan's home islands would mean unimaginable loss, perhaps millions of casualties on both sides. In Washington, the leaders of the United States faced a choice that would define history. Months earlier, deep within secret laboratories across the nation, scientists had worked under the code name, the Manhattan Project, a mission to harness the power of the atom. What began as a race to prevent Nazi Germany from building a superweapon had now become America's ultimate card. The bomb was ready. The question was no longer could it be used, but should it? President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, bore the crushing responsibility of that decision. His advisors warned that Japan's refusal to surrender meant the war could drag on indefinitely. Every day more soldiers would die, more cities would burn, and more innocents would suffer. Yet the weapon they now possessed carried a power beyond comprehension, a single device that could erase an entire city in seconds. Truman's words would later echo through history. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world." The target chosen first was Hiroshima, a major military center and port city. The morning of August 6, 1945 was calm and clear. Children walked to school, Workers began their routines, and life moved forward under the illusion of normalcy. Above them, a lone B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew high and silent, carrying a bomb nicknamed Little Boy. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the bomb's bay doors opened, and the world changed forever. For 43 seconds it fell through the sky, spinning slowly. Then, a flash brighter than the sun. A wave of heat reaching thousands of degrees tore through the city. Within seconds, Hiroshima was gone. Buildings vanished, people were turned to shadows on walls, and fires erupted in every direction. The blast flattened everything within 2 miles. A mushroom cloud rose into the sky, climbing nearly 40,000 feet, a symbol of both victory and horror. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more would perish in the days and weeks that followed from burns, radiation, and wounds that medicine could not heal. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, as Japan's leaders debated surrender, another B-29 bomber took flight, this one carrying Fat Man, a plutonium bomb far more powerful than the first. Its intended target was the city of Kokura, but heavy clouds obscured the area. The bomber turned toward its secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb fell. The explosion ripped through the city's valleys and hills, reducing Nagasaki to rubble. Factories, homes, temples, all consumed in an instant. Around 70,000 people were killed, and thousands more would suffer in the aftermath. The destruction was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Survivors described the sky as turning to fire, the ground melting beneath their feet. The air itself seemed to scream. Those who lived through the initial blast faced the unseen terror of radiation, sickness, burns, and slow death. The bombs had not just ended lives. They had altered the very nature of existence. The age of nuclear power had begun, and with it came the realization that humanity had now forged the means to destroy itself. The Japanese government, faced with annihilation, could no longer deny the inevitable. Emperor Hirohito, breaking centuries of tradition, addressed his people directly for the first time in history. His voice, solemn and distant, spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, and the necessity to endure the unendurable. Japan accepted the terms of surrender, and the Second World War, after 6 years of global devastation, was finally over. Yet victory came at an unbearable cost. Across the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, silence reigned. The once bustling streets were now wastelands. The smell of ash lingered for months. The rivers ran dark, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the skeletal remains of cities. American soldiers who later entered the ruins were struck silent by what they saw. A world turned to dust. An entire civilization burned into memory. The atomic bombings sparked immediate debate, both then and forever after. Some saw them as a necessary evil, the only way to end the war swiftly and save countless lives that would have been lost in invasion. Others saw them as an unspeakable act of destruction, the moment when humanity crossed a line it could never retreat from. In those few seconds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, mankind had touched godlike power, and with it came a shadow that would never fade. The American scientists who had built the bomb, many of them once driven by patriotism and fear of Nazi advancement, now wrestled with guilt. Some wept when they heard the news. Others began to warn of the new danger that hung over the world: nuclear war. They realized that their creation had not just ended a conflict. It had opened a door that could never again be closed. In the years that followed, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols, not of triumph alone, but of warning. Cities of ghosts, forever etched into the conscience of humanity. The survivors, the hibakusha, carried the scars of radiation and the burden of memory, telling their stories so the world would never forget what happened when power surpassed compassion. Across the Pacific, the American flag waved in victory, but it did so beneath a sky forever changed. The thunder of war had finally gone silent, but the silence itself was haunting. The same nation that had risen from the ashes of Pearl Harbor now stood as the world's most powerful force, armed not just with courage and steel, but with a weapon that could end civilization itself. The world that emerged after Hiroshima and Nagasaki was no longer the same world that had entered the war. The boundaries of warfare had shifted. The lessons of courage and sacrifice remained, but they now carried the weight of an unspoken truth. That victory, when bought with such destruction, left scars not only on the earth, but on the very soul of mankind.